Welcome, everybody. My name is Fernando Brancoli. I'm from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm also part of the Security in Context platform. And we are just starting our panel about understanding Latin America's shifting stance towards Israel. And I'm going briefly to introduce our panelists and just talking briefly what we want to do today. I mean, of course, everybody from our platform and colleagues, we are all trying to understand what's going on the tragedy right now happening in Gaza. We are all absurdly sad as academic and also as activists about the sheer amount of civilian casualties and the killing of civilians in Gaza right now. So what we are trying to do is basically to engage in this incredible panel to actually discuss a little bit what's happening right now in Latin America and if there is a changing shift on the politics of the states and on state actors in the region and what sort of impact we can have on this kind of things. So we are going to have people watching us from Facebook and from Zoom on YouTube. If you are on Zoom, I will ask our colleagues who are watching us to use this little button called Q&A, where you can send the questions and everything to our panelists, and then we can discuss this. And the whole idea is basically to have our three panelists speaking a little bit in the beginning about their perspectives regarding the politics in Latin America towards the tragedy right now in Gaza, and of course, specifically about Israel. And then we can open for a broad discussion. And of course, I'm going to invite all of you who are watching us right now or the recording afterwards to actually visit our website in Security in Context, where we are gathering this incredible platform of research, trying to understand what's going on in the global south in a critical way. So in this sense, let me present you guys our great panelists who gladly accept our invitation in such a short notice. And I'd like to also thank Professor Janaína Rosbelinda to help us organize all this. So our first panelist is Dr. Marta Kuri. She is an associate professor at the Centro de Estudios Internacionales in the Colegio de México in Mexico. We also have Maricio Jaramillo Jassir, who is an associate professor in the Facultad de Estudios Internacionales, Políticos y Urbanos in la Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. And also Pablo Alvarez Cabello, a professor at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. They are all great specialists on this cause, and again, they answer us in really short notice. So we're really, really happy to have those specialists to discuss with this regarding this. I'm going to be the really boring guy who's going to let you three know when time is over. So I'm going to be waving my hands or things like that. But please go ahead. I think we can start with Marta, if it's okay for you. Marta, thank you so much for joining us today. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fernando. Thanks all. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. I would begin by saying that on the issue of Palestine, positions in Latin America have tended to be fragmented. In relation to the current conflict, three relatively different positions have been seen. One, I mean, I'm being very schematic, of course, but one is a great support for Israel of its right to self-defense no matter what. The second, an insistence on Israeli occupation and the violation of Palestinian rights. And a third, which is a position, stance in search for equidistance. These options can be explained, of course, by a mix of domestic and external factors. I will not go on into the details of each of them right now, but I will point at some elements as part of these introductory remarks. I would first point at the role of leaders, because Latin American countries' constitutions usually give prerogative to heads of states in this domain, but it's also an embedded practice. So their preferences and their worldviews remain crucial, I think, to explain some diplomatic public stances in this war. So, for example, we have the Colombian president talking about the liberation struggle of the Jewish people against Nazi rule to interpret Palestinians' reality and resistance. And being a former member of the guerrilla, undoubtedly, contributed, in my view, to this analogical reasoning. In turn, Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele, of Palestinian descent, established a parallel between the Salvatrucha gangs and Hamas, whose members he described as wild beasts and animals. In this case, his analogy clearly, in my view, serves the purpose of obtaining international legitimacy for his profoundly autocratic regime. In Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador's deep lack of interest in international issues helps explain also in some measure, to some extent, Mexico's first reactions. Of course, individual preferences can have mixed consequences, which in any case must be analyzed in combination with variables at the domestic and the international levels. A second main observation in the ongoing war is that the positioning on the political spectrum has not determined Latin American governments' stances in this war. So we do not find homogeneous positions among leftist or more progressive governments. So Brazil did something different to what the Chilean government did, or the Colombian, or the Argentinian, nor homogeneous positions. We don't find them among rather right or conservative governments. So, and this is not new. In particular, not only the Latin American left is plural, but it is not only left-wing leaders who have worked towards rapprochement with Palestine. So that we have to remember that. For example, the right-wing Chilean president Sebastián Piñera in 2014, made the first visit by a Chilean head of state to the Palestinian territory. So his Peruvian counterpart, Alan Garcia, the same. So, and in all cases, except for Cuba, traditionally from Cuba, Venezuela, the left has tried to avoid extreme politicization of ties, as demonstrated by the good relations with Israel they've normally sought to keep, in spite of, speaking about Palestinians and everything. So, well, the exception this time seems to be Colombia with President Gustavo Petro. We can discuss it. But so I would highlight this, the role of the president's preferences and perhaps also bureaucratic dynamics, inter-bureaucratic politics in some countries. And these help us elucidate the weight of two other variables: pressures from the international system, and in particular Washington, the United States, and pressures from domestic and transnational non-state actors. And the third remark I would like to make now is that Latin American statements in the war in Gaza are to be inscribed within the framework of these countries' economic diplomacies and defense diplomacies, which register a pattern of continuity since approximately 2013. That is, these are diplomacies which seem to persist, or foreign policy instruments which seem to persist beyond political alternations. And in these realms, but particularly in the second, in defense and intelligence realms, Israel stands out. And this trend can be seen as part of a domestic and regional trends, both in the MENA region, in the Middle East region, and in Latin American and Caribbean region, which are quite different to those of the first decade of the 21st century, which saw the booming of relations between Arab and Latin American countries. I'll leave it here, and of course, we can discuss any of these elements later on. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Marta. And I'll pass the floor to Professor Mauricio, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to say thanks to Belinda, who addressed me the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you, Fernando, Marta, and Pablo Alvarez. Well, I think that for me, there is like three elements, like the basic to understand what's happening right now in Latin America vis-a-vis this crisis in the Middle East. I think that the first is that we have like this expectation that this second wave of left governments was going to be like the other one, like the early 2000. I think that Marta just said it. For example, Lula in his first presidency was very active in order to create that link between Arab world and South America, between Africa and South America. Chavez played a very important role, for example, in the war between Lebanon and Israel in 2006. I remember that he practically break all the diplomatic ties with Tel Aviv. Was the only government, I think, in the Western Hemisphere who did that. And I think that we had like this expectation that maybe Boric, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, like Marta said, or maybe Lula, were going to be very active defending the Palestinian cause. But for example, when I see the reaction of Boric, he only said, for example, that after Israel has bombed a refugee camp, the only reaction is to say that Israel has violated the international humanitarian law. The only president right now who has been able to speak about, to talk about, to label the situation as genocide is Gustavo Petro. And that's very weird because I think that the profile that we were expected to do that was Lula da Silva. So that's the first reflection for me. That's the first conclusion, that this new cycle of leftist governments are very different from the first because they have no room for foreign policy. And the second element is exactly that. I think that right now foreign policy is not important. Integration, regional integration is not important for us. When you see, for example, the dismantle of UNASUR, the South American Union, when you see the dismantle of CELAC, and that was caused because of the Venezuela crisis. I remember that, for example, from 2017 or 16 or 18, I don't remember well, the region decided to isolate Venezuela. And in this reaction, I think that they closed all the multilateral spaces. So right now, in front of the war, we have no space of political dialogue. So for us, it's very difficult to take a position, and also the priorities of the countries are really like internal, like domestic. And I also think that we have to be very realistic. I'm sad to say that, but Latin America is not relevant. So the calculus of the most people right here is why are we going to support? Why we're going to make some pressure? Are we going to protest if our presidents are so irrelevant? And I think that obviously that for me is a mistake. When you see, for example, what Petro has done, I think is not as effective to end the war, but I think it's like coherent. It's like what we are expecting from a left government. When I saw, for example, Boric, AMLO, Lula, I see, for me, it's like a big disappointment. So I would like to end this first comment saying that for me, it's like more or less like normal. I think that right now the governments are more concerned about internal. For example, for Boric, the most I would like to hear what Pablo has to say about that. But for Boric, for example, the first topic for him is the new constitution. Lula has no majority in his Congress. Andrés López Obrador is, I think, is thinking about Morena's renovation and the next election next year. And the only president who's really concerned about what is going on in Gaza Strip and West Bank is Gustavo Petro. So I think that with this landscape, there are not many reasons to be optimistic, but I would say that maybe with the speech of Gustavo Petro, maybe other governments are going to react, because we cannot accept this situation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Pablo. Professor Pablo, do you want to follow?
Yes. I have little to add to what Marta and Mauricio said, but I think I have three things to point it out. First is that I don't think we are experiencing a very important shift in diplomacy or foreign policy in this world, because the diplomacy and multilateralism are very important to our countries, and we saw that in the Ukrainian war, Russian and Ukrainian war. All of our governments pointed out that it's important that the rule of law and diplomacy act in the war. And I think we are experiencing the same kind of language and policy in this war. But there is another element here that is very important. Mauricio just said that we could expect something like the first wave of left wings governments in the early 2000s, when presidents like Lula or Chavez straightened out the relations between our countries and Middle Eastern countries. But in that context, we were experiencing a commodities prices that could help that kind of policy. And right now we are not experiencing that. So all the governments are focused on the domestic issues. And here in Chile that is the case. You know, Boric is a very left-wing activist politician with a very strong discourse on the Middle Eastern wars and that kind of things. But in this moment, he's preoccupied with the constitution, the constitutional matter, and he's not very into the foreign policy issues. The second thing is that in all Latin America, we have Arabs community, Palestinians community, there and Jewish communities that are very important, but they are experiencing changes, cultural changes also. So they are not very into the foreign policy issues right now. That's the case in Chile, you know. Palestinian community in Chile, or the majority of Palestinian community in Chile, are not in the preoccupied of the war. They are evidently they are interested in the humanitarian aspect of the war, but they are not very vocal about their stance on the war right now, because they are preoccupied about the other things that are important to them in the domestic field. So I don't think that the Arab community, the Palestinian community in Chile, at least, are very important group of pressure in the government to speak out about the war right now. And the third thing is that I think it's not that relevant, but I think it could be relevant in the future. The importance of evangelical right-wing groups in parts of Latin America, like Brazil, Chile. They are very vocal. They are very strong right now, in Bolsonaro's government, they were very important, and all of them are very close to Zionism. So I think that's a little element that is not to be regarded. I think that right-wing groups, evangelical fundamentalist groups here in Latin America are getting stronger, and they are very close to Zionism. So that could be a very important issue in the future. But I agree with Mauricio and Marta. We are not experiencing a very important stance on this war with our governments. So it's not much to say,
Great. Thank you, Professor Pablo. I think you just started really good. We already got a question from the audience, and talking for those of you who are watching us, you can actually send a directly question through the Q&A button just below us. But I have a question for the three of you, and also a question from the audience. I think we can move in this way. And I think part of the discussion is already sort of being addressed by the three of you. The very first point, and I think Maricio emphasized this, is I would like to hear from the three of you what, in the end of the day, Latin America can do. I mean, if we are just performative actions, we are just struggling discursive motives for something that is so far away from us that we don't have the economic, or the military, or the political power to actually address. And I'm saying this from Brazil, where Lula is quite sure that he can mediate Israel and Hamas. I mean, I don't know if it's an egocentric side of him, or if he's actually being invited by some Arabic countries like Qatar to play a larger role in this. I mean, Brazil was the president of the Security Council last month, and he was trying to push for a resolution regarding this. So I would like to hear the three of you, if in the end of the day, we are looking more into a sort of performative political discourses and actions, and it's not going to make big change on this. My second point, and I think it's connected to the question I'm going to present to you from the audience, is related to a sort of spinning over effect or boomerang effect to the Latin American countries. For example, we already have in Brazil now discussions that somehow Hezbollah is playing a larger role in Brazil, who is a complete invention, who is like basically being created because the conflict is basically now a domestic issue in Brazil right now. So if we're looking on how those narratives between Palestine and Israel is basically being played for domestic politics too, and if this is somehow can create a different scenario, different discussions on this. On this sense, we already got a question from the great Mauricio. So Mauricio asked us if we think that domestic opposition movements can motivate or limit national positions or discourse towards Israel. I think Professor Pablo actually mentioned this when he was mentioning the neo-evangelicals of those countries. So how do you address how specific oppositions or domestic oppositions are also integrating the Israeli-Hamas discussion into a domestic point of view? So with these comments, Professor Marta, if you want to start.
Yes, thank you for all the comments and questions. I'll say, for example, concerning this, the presence of Hezbollah, I think it points at something, the role of the military. If we take the domestic level of analysis in these countries, the military is an important factor to take into account for some of these countries. In the wake of various governmental changes in Latin America, to which my colleagues are already, have alluded, the role of military representatives has become more explicit in the links with the Middle East. They appear as partners in security negotiations and intelligence negotiations. So we saw it in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro, who promoted this increasing participation of military actors in politics, but not only in Brazil. And the approach to Israel, in this sense, can also be explained by through this evolution, this development, and might be associated with this securitization processes, illustrated by the narrative on terrorism in Argentina and on Iranian and Islamic presence in this triple frontier, how it's called in the United States, this border area shared by Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. And in the context of this war in Gaza, Lebanese Hezbollah's alleged South American operations have been in the spotlight again since the arrest in Brazil of 2 people, I think, accused of planning a terrorist attacks on November the 11th. And Paraguay is part of this. Paraguay was, in fact, the second country in Latin America to classify Hezbollah on its list of terrorist organizations. Argentina did it also. Of the 3 countries that make up this tri-border strip, no Brazilian government to date has yet included Hezbollah on the list of terrorist organizations. And this can be explained by trade relations, important trade relations that exist between Brasilia and Tehran, and as well as the very large Lebanese diaspora in Brazil, which I think are important elements that help explain why. But this concern has grown in Venezuela and Uruguay and Peru. In terms of what the role that Latin American actors play in conflict mediation what can Latin America do? Some see that opportunity in the return to the left, as my colleagues already mentioned in Latin America. But Lula's, for example, return to power takes place in a domestic and international context very different from that of the first decade. As one of our colleagues has mentioned, has shown how governments, for example, previous governments of Michel Temer and Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil foreign policy has been reduced to commercial interests with Israel and with some Arab countries, notably Lebanon and the Gulf monarchies. But we also have domestically in Brazil a political and social scene polarized, and the role of the diplomatic bureaucracy of Itamaraty has been diminished. So what we've seen in the past wars, for example, the past war in 2021 in May in Gaza, the position of Latin American countries was to condemn violence, again, to call for peace and so on. But it seems that in the end, the problem is always reduced to, or is perceived as, terrorist actions by Hamas, rocket fire, and Israel responding with the right to defend itself. This time in this war, perhaps we have witnessed, as Maricio has already said, a slight difference in the sense that some countries have spoken out more openly, like Colombia, or clearly against Israeli occupation, have called it that way. And but it stops there. I mean, hardly anyone enters into a more sophisticated or like productive discussion. During that war, by the way, the war of 2021, the Secretary of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, described Hamas as a terrorist organization. And this declaration raised more controversy than consensus within the regional organization. But what it showed was that the context of the weakening of Latin American regionalism, as has been pointed out by Pablo and Maricio. It also reflects the absence of Venezuela and the decline of Brazilian leadership. So I think that the rise and decline of the Brazilian leadership has marked the rhythm of these diplomacies in general in this war. And my last point concerning one of the questions about the opposition, I would say that generally speaking, in general, public opinion. A lot later, I'm going to talk about the opposition, but I think it is important to talk about public opinion because Latin American public opinion does not seem essential in explaining Latin American foreign policy decision-making or outcomes regarding Middle Eastern issues, not even during critical periods concerning Palestine, unless the country has an important diaspora, either Jewish or Palestinian, or an important, indeed, evangelical community. And still, because their influence must always be accounted for in relation to other factors at the political, economic, social level. So in such cases, of course, their weight might become quite important. And this is what the differences in the degree of condemnation against the Israeli military operation in Gaza suggest. Argentina is perhaps one of the most illustrative cases of the importance of the opposition and public opinion when it comes to Middle Eastern matters. According to some analysts, for example, relations with Iran was a factor in the defeat of the Kirchnerist candidate during the 2015 elections. Otherwise, we can also say that the Palestinian-Israeli question and the ongoing war in particular can count in election cycles when decisions by Latin American governments in this regard might end up affecting the economy. So, for example, in Mexico, I do not think it will play a role. First, because Mexico's position so far has been to call for peace, international law, and to remain actually nothing ambiguous. By the way, last June, Mexico elevated the status of the special delegation of Palestine to the status of embassy, but still does not recognize Palestine as a state. This position can be associated to a great extent, in my opinion, to economic and political needs, which concern the United States, namely trade and migration. For instance, there has been economic uncertainty due to the renegotiation of the trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. We must recall that Mexico's trade is highly dependent on the US. Second, migration is a central issue in our bilateral relations, and there has been a transnational articulation of interests in this migration file, also in the fight against drug cartels, against weapons smuggling to Mexico. So in previous years, these topics, which are big priorities for Mexico, have been raised by interest groups in Mexico, in the United States, with State Department officials, with key members of the US Congress. Conditioning also would suggest, this suggests that there is a conditioning, of this kind of aid and cooperation in exchange for Mexico's not, criticizing that much Israel in international multilateral fora. And an interrelated element is Israel's presence in the Mexican-American border security. The BDS movement has mobilized against these contracts of cybersecurity and other kinds of cooperation to limit and criminalize migration. So Mexico's economic agenda development model have been embodied in a particularly assertive diplomacy towards Israel. And I think it is the case for other countries as well in Latin America. And well, in the case of, and I'll leave it here, for the Palestinian diaspora in Mexico, it has very, very few members, so it doesn't really count in order to mobilize pressure groups or opposition or political parties, or because the descendants of Middle Eastern immigrants in Mexico are Syrian Lebanese, but they have often constructed a Lebanese Mexican identity based, as Teresa Alfaro has studied this topic, based more on the assertion of a Phoenician past and a claim to uniqueness, which does not really want to be entangled in Palestinian or Arab issues in general.
That's great. Thank you, Marta. Mauricio?
Yeah, well, I do agree, and I just want to complement with a few elements. I would say first that I think that we are in a turning point in the relationship between Latin America and the Middle East. I think it's very difficult for Israel, for example, to have the same image that it has had until now. So I think the only country I'm not sure that hasn't recognized Palestine is Paraguay. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the countries right now not to recognize, not to reinforce the relationships with Palestine after the war. And that's for me a big change, that maybe once the war has finished, I think that's going to be one of the most important consequences. Then I think that the mediation of Brazil, I think it can work since Brazil do it with another middle power. For example, with Turkey. Turkey has a very special relationship with Israel, that right now is in a very bad shape because, among others, the most of the infrastructure that Israel has attacked has been built with money, with resources from Ankara. So I think that maybe in the middle term, if we think, for example, in a group composed by Turkey, Brazil, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or other countries that could enhance, that could lead to a mediation. But right now I see it very difficult because Brazil by himself has not enough force. Then I think that it's very interesting what Petro has proposed in two ways. The first one is to ask the International Crime Court to investigate the war crimes and the genocide crime. And I think it's very important to stress that if the International Crime Court is not able to judge what is happening right now in Gaza, I think it's going to be a failure. I think it's going to be, it's very difficult to justify the existence, the legitimacy of International Crime Court after the war if the court is not going to be able to do it something, because what we have seen right now in Gaza, I think has no, I mean, the only situation that is comparable is the Second World War II. But not even Biafra, Rwanda, Darfur, I think this is the worst. And it's the worst because we have seen so many videos, so many images. So for me, I think this is like a turning point for the International Crime Court. And the other thing is this proposition that Petro put it on the table, that Palestine has to be a full member, a full state with the use of sovereignty. Palestine has to control their own limits, their borders. And I think this is the moment where Latin America, as a continent, as a group, could be important in some ways supporting Petro's proposal. The second element that for me is very important right now is the stereotypes. I'm very concerned about Israeli propaganda, about Hamas, about Hezbollah. I have seen, for example, right here in some very serious media, from reports of the presence of Hezbollah in the north of Colombia. And for me, it's very clear. The purpose is very clear, is to promote, I don't know how to say it in English, it's like Islamophobia or Arabophobia. Is this stereotype that all the Muslims are terrorists? Is this stereotype that the Arab world is a risk for the world? And we have seen what has happened in the war against the global war that launched in the early 2000s, George Bush. So I think a very similar atmosphere, and for me is very concerning. I saw, for example, what Edward Said would have called Orientalism, this idea that the Middle East region, the only civilized country is Israel, and we have to support Israel. Israel is in his own right to defend from Hamas. And I think that we, as citizens, we have to counterbalance those narratives, those misinformations, those fake news. Le Monde, for example, just confirmed that the rocket fire that destroyed partially Al-Shifa hospital was launched by Israel. So I think that we as citizens in Latin America, we have to counterbalance, we have to face this risk of promoting hate using those categories, and especially terrorism, that is a concept that is, as we know, is a Western concept, is an Orientalism that has had a big cost for the Middle East societies. And I think that this is like, in third place, I would say that this is an opportunity. I mean, it's very difficult to look at it like that, but I think this is an opportunity. I think that it was Fernando who said it at the beginning. I think this is an opportunity to reinforce the dialogue, the South-South dialogue. We have here, like in the case of Chile, a lot of people who came from the Middle East. I think there is like 500,000 of people, of Palestinians. And we have here, for example, the problem here, for example, I don't know if it's the same in Brazil or in Mexico. The problem here with Arab population, with Arab communities, is that they are very divided. We have like a strong community in sense of unity in the case of Syrian and Lebanese, but the Palestinians here are isolated, for example. The Lebanese, for example, are right now nearer Israel position than Palestinian position. So that for me, that's another concern that it shows that the Arab world is not unified, is not united. We know that the Arabs have abandoned the Palestinian cause since the 70s. And I think that that abandon finally reflects in somehow the perception of the other Arab world right now in Latin America. And I would say that my last remark, I would say that I think that maybe we could promote in Latin America a rejection of the genocide, a rejection of the apartheid. I think that with the social media, with the democratization of the mass media, with these images that we have seen in the recent weeks, the reports from some non-governmental organizations like B'Tselem, we have seen things that people right here was not aware of. So I think that this is like some kind of awakening in Latin America about Middle East situation. There is a lot of people who had no idea of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. There is people who haven't even was aware about the existence of Palestine. And I think that this is like another opportunity to be more conscious, to be more aware about what's happening. And I think that from now on, Latin America will have less excuses to justify the genocide that is going on.
Great, thank you, Maricio. Pablo?
Okay, I think Marta and Mauricio said the main things, and I would like to say a couple of things to complement that. First, about the opposition groups in Latin America regarding this war and the declarations of the governments. I hear this something interesting because, for example, in Chile, Palestinian community, there is very important and very large, like Mauricio said. You have politicians in the right wing and also on the left wing. For instance, we had a very important mayor of a city here in Santiago, of a community here in Santiago, who is a Palestinian descendant, and he is a communist from the Communist Party. He is very important, a very important politician, very vocal about the Palestinians' rights. But on the other side, we have a very traditional right-wing politician like Iván Moreira, who is also a very vocal voice on the Palestinian rights. So it doesn't matter is that regarding the Palestinian issue, it doesn't matter if you are from a right wing or a left wing on the traditional party system. The important element of change here is the right wing fundamentalist evangelical groups. Those groups are very near Zionist propaganda, but they are very new and they are very vocal also. But in Chile, they are very small, very vocal, but very small. the second thing, it's something that Mauricio pointed out, but I would like to stress that the concern about the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Chile and Argentina, that are two places that I know very well. A lot. I have seen a lot of propaganda on media and the social media regarding this war, which is very sympathetic with anti-Semitism, with the classic anti-Semitism tropes, like the Jews are trying to control the world and so on and so on. And also I have seen a lot of messages about that all Muslims are terrorists and so on and so on. So the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is very concerning, and I think wars like this war in Gaza are a very important frame of rising the discourses of hate, and that concern me a lot. Here I see a question about the resistant groups, like in Chile, the Mapuches. I think that is a very important question, because here in Chile and also in other parts of Latin America, resistant groups, indigenous groups are very important pressure groups in regarding the rights of the people, of the displaced people, the suffering people in the world. They are very vocal about the Palestinian rights to defend themselves, but they are very vocal, but not that important in regarding the foreign policy issues. So I think that it's more like a domestic importance, not that important on the matter of the framing of the foreign policy. So it's a very very interesting thing to analyze, but I don't think that is that important on this matter.
Great, thank you, Pablo. So we are moving to our final remarks, because we are going to have an hour soon. To those of you who are watching us right now, I'd like to invite to actually check the publications from these three professors. The three of them have been publishing a lot of articles, books, and edited volumes regarding this subject. I've been using some of it with my students, so I think it will be great also to follow up what they have been doing regarding this. I mean, we have this really rich discussion being done in Latin America, not only between a connection from Latin American countries and the Middle East, but also trying to perceive what's happening in the Middle East through a sort of global South lens, which I think is quite interesting. So with this last 10 minutes, I will let you guys make some final remarks, and we have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to cherry pick some of them, and you don't have to answer, of course, all of it, because I think we can spend another hour discussion these kind of things. So again, we have questions from Sophia, Mauricio again, anonymous attendee, and Zahra, and also from Janeiro in the chat. And I think some of the discussions, I mean, Sophia and also Janeiro has been mentioning some domestic elements from groups in Colombia who has been getting some money and some power from Israeli cooperation, especially in the military side, and if this can play a larger role on this. And Sophia was interested, I think, Pablo, what you've been mentioning regarding indigenous communities and how this is connected to a large struggle. And I think you already mentioned some of those points. And well, in Brazil, for example, Bolsonaro has been making all those crazy connections between Hamas and the landless movements. the MST. So this has been happening a lot of times. I mean, making those weird connections to emphasize some violence and things like this. Zara actually asked the determinants of Latino awareness toward the Palestinian issue. If it's not only for the number of Palestinian Arabic origins and diaspora, not only the evangelical groups, what else could be a pressure for the decision makers? And if you witness something related to this, and Mauricio also mentioned if the role of academia, I mean, something like us right now, bringing up the Palestinian occupation and raising awareness. From the Brazilian point of view, I think the Palestinian issue and the tragedy in Gaza is basically the main discussion in our university in the last weeks. I mean, everybody's discussing everything. Every time we have a protest, now connected to any student issue, you will see and witness a Palestinian flag waving somewhere there. So there's all those connections making. So great questions. Thank you so much for our audience making this. And again, thank you so much for all our from our three professors. You don't have to answer all those questions because we're going to stay here for another hour for this. But if you want to pick one of those topics and of course emphasize your final remarks, is going to be great. Marta, I'm picking you again.
Yeah,
Sorry for this. You're always
sure.
starting.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I'll try to bring some of these questions together and also add my final remarks because yes, they're very interesting and they point at different elements that must be followed up in the following weeks and that we have to keep an eye on. But in general, I mean, this opposition, this would come from the left, but the left mainly, but also like the traditional right. But the problem is that the left is very, very weakened in many of these countries, and the fact that also Latin America's geopolitical scenario is still dominated by the U.S. I think the U.S. policies are still a determinant factor in many of these cases, and the results of the U.S. presidential election will certainly, in the sense, be a game changer for these countries' Palestinian policies, Israel-Palestinian policies. It remains to be seen whether the fact that a part of public opinion in the United States and partisan discussion in the United States has been showing like this shift towards Palestinian rights will have any impact in Latin American governments and also in the discussions in the universities among students, professors. I think it is having an impact already. But nowadays, the pressure still, I mean, from and dependence on the US and fear of annoying important U.S. allies to still largely explain the stance taken towards Israel and Palestine. So the role Latin American actors can play depends not only on the improvement of their domestic and economic environment, which would improve their regionalist efforts in some way, but the role depends also, of course, on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, an issue that, as we all know, remains on the agenda of many southern countries. Unfortunately, there is also now a worldwide democratic backsliding, which threatens multilateralism, where Latin America could make, like a difference. However, I mean, one would hope that international organizations will prove once again to be resilient, and respondent much more than expected right now, and that they would become an effective fora for Latin America in this matter. Any action by Latin American countries in this topic needs to go hand in hand with the political will and realistic management of governments, backed by a continuous work of effective diplomacy, but also, and this relates to the Orientalist discussion we were having before, new means of socialization, of communication with societies, not only at government level, but with Israeli and Palestinian civil societies and Arab societies in general, through cultural diplomacy. I believe the potential is there at the societal level for bringing about potential solidarities and pathways for more effective diplomacies, either bilaterally or within multilateral organizations.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor. Mauricio, do you want to make some brief comments and your final remarks, please?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Fernando. I would like to answer Janaina question because it's about Colombia. I think that there is two processes that are going on right now in Colombia. One is the peace approach of Gustavo Petro, Paz Total, and I think that in that idea, in that purpose, the idea of reducing military expenditure is very important. So that's like the good moment to maybe to take from distance from Israel. And what we have seen in the last weeks is, I mean, I have never seen a Colombia's president who has been so hard, who has been so tough on what Israel is doing right now. So I think it's a very good moment. I think there is anyway some kind of blackmailing from Israel because we are a very, very vulnerable country. We are very dependent from the United States resources, as Marta just said. So I think that there is like a very good chance that we have right now in order to have like a new balance between our relationship with Israel and with Palestine. Yeah. And I would say that we have to, right now in Colombia, we are going to see like a very important reduction in the Israel influence. I think, as I just said, it's going to be very difficult to Tel Aviv to reestablish its image. I remember in 2002, maybe you too, when Jose Saramago visited West Bank, and he said that this sentence was very controversial, that Auschwitz is like, or West Bank has become or like Auschwitz or so on. I think that show us like a very important turning point in which the most of people in the world realized that Palestinians were suffering from something that maybe was like in some way similar to what happened in the Second World War. So I think that in Colombia right now it's happening almost the same because of the Petros speeches, because of the Petros statements, because of Petros tweets that are at the same time controversial, but I think that to me they are really like relevant. And my final comment would be that we as scholars, I think that we must engage in this fight, especially the fight of the information warfare, the warfare of narratives, where the world is divided between the goods and the evil. We are, as I just said, for me I am very concerned because of the re-emergence of this. I remember that in that moment George Bush saying, "Who is not with us is against us," and I think there is like some re-emergence of this logic. So I think that we have to counterbalance this trend, and we have to publish, we have to controvert the medias, we have to dialogue, and especially we have to dialogue without passing by the North, because I think that this is the most critical problem that we have in the global South, that our communications are always channeled by the United States and Europe. And I think that's, as I just said, I think this is a good moment for the global South to have more influence on the world and to insist in that idea that multilateralism has to prevail in this war.
That's great. Thank you so much, Pablo.
Yes, well, Marta and Mauricio said the main things. I think that right now it's very important, I think, that Latin America speak out, and we have to address this issue on the diplomatic field, and pointed out that it's important that multilateralism and reform of the Security Council in the United Nations, it's very important, and I think it's an opportunity, like Mauricio said, but every opportunity can be missed, and we have the obligation to not miss this opportunity and speak out for Palestine, for Palestinian people, and for humanity.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I think we just missed one of our professors, but she's probably coming back. But anyway, I would like to thank so much all of you for attending today, from our uh, spectators, from our colleagues who are watching us. Again, to Professor Pablo, to Professor Mauricio, to all the security and context team who has been able to, in such short notice, to organize this. I think we actually implemented a lot of great discussions. We can try to move on in the near future, because I think this subject is not going, like Professor Maricio just said, is not going anywhere in the near future. I think it's going to be a really important political subject we will have to address as global South scholars, activists, and things like that. Again, for those of you watching us, these three professors, they have been doing amazing work uh, writing and engaging in really interesting articles and books regarding these topics. I invite you all to look for it, use with your colleagues and students. I know I have been using a lot of what they have been discussing with my own students back home. Again, thank all the security context team for organizing to make all this infrastructure to deal with this.